The Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 22nd chapter. Once more Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, look, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go, therefore, into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet.' Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
How often do you feel like the king in that parable? How often do you have an experience where you've worked so hard to create or plan something and it does not come to fruition? Or having a situation where you've invested time, capital, and energy, but end up being ignored? Like maybe you've taken the time to prepare a meal and no one comes to eat with you. Or you've bought all this candy for Halloween, but only a handful of trick-or-treaters show up at your door. You might offer a small favor to another person, only to have that small favor suddenly turn into a big favor, and all knowing that there's going to be no recognition of that contribution. The king in Jesus' parable today wanted to see something happen a certain way, and when it didn't, he got frustrated and angry and violent, simply because other people would not accept or participate in what he had offered them. And they themselves, those other people, also got frustrated and angry and violent. As I was listening to this parable, my mind went to all of those little situations where I have felt ignored or rejected, and then how I've responded in those moments. But in the same time, when I heard this parable, my heart began to think about so many other situations that we are hearing about happening all around the world. My heart has been heavy lately, thinking about the enormity of trouble that surrounds us, the enormity of pain that has been placed on our neighbors, people created in the image of God all around the world, and the enormity of the brokenness that exists within us as human beings. And as I reflect on those things, suddenly my little irritations are put into perspective. So maybe, like me, some of you have come to church today in search of some hope and good news from our God to address these situations. Maybe you've come hoping to hear the promise that the God of love and peace will suddenly make everything right once again. You come here, and all you get is another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. Now, maybe we again need to be reminded about what parables are meant to do. They are meant to get us thinking. They give us some real-life, concrete ways of how God's kingdom, this work of God, is meant to be experienced among us. They're meant to be flexible enough to mean different things to different people and be able to change over time. But then most often, though, they are also meant to afflict us, not so much comfort us, so that we might begin to respond in a different way from how we are currently living. So Jesus tells his listeners, this king, he sent his slaves to call in all of these who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they just didn't come. So the king sent other slaves out, and he says, hey, tell those people who have been invited, come on, I've prepared dinner. The oxen and the calves, they're cooked, they're waiting, they're getting cold. Everything's ready. Come on, come to the banquet. So this is where we witness why this king becomes so frustrated. He and his family and his servants have prepared this meal, this banquet, this huge celebration. They've invited scores of people to come to this wedding banquet, yet no one would. In that day and age, that kind of response was unheard of. It was a slap in the face to the host, and especially if that host was the king. But even with that, no one came. So we heard the king sent out more people explaining and almost begging those people, those invited guests, to come, and still no one would come. Jesus said they made light of it. They went away. They went to their farm, back home to their business. And the others, they seized those slaves. They mistreated them. And they killed them. Not only did those invited guests refuse the invitation and disrespect the host, the king, the people responded with violence and killed the messengers. I wonder, as we hear this parable, do we feel like the king in this parable? One way that I think we frequently interpret parables is to equate God with the king, which might often make sense. Okay, so in this case, we picture God hosting a party, inviting the people, maybe us, to come and join the celebration, but we refuse, we become violent, we ignore the hospitality of God. Okay, all of that sounds fairly reasonable until you get to the next part of the parable. Upon refusing the invitation, the king was enraged. The king sent his troops, destroyed the murderers, and burned their city to the ground. All right, that doesn't sound very godlike. Unless we've come to see God as a punishing God who takes out his wrath on all those who don't comply and show up at the table. And sometimes I think that we've been taught to see it that way. Do as God says, or else. But then as the parable continues, we hear how this king then invites any and everyone, whoever was standing around in the streets, to come be a part of this party. Okay. There's, once again, the welcoming God that we all know and love, until the parable turns again. The king shows up. The king encounters a guest who had no idea just moments earlier that he would be showing up at a wedding banquet. The king shows up to the celebration and sees this person who's not wearing the right attire. And the king becomes enraged. He says to his attendants, bind him hand and foot, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen. And again, I confess I struggle with making sense of our loving, forgiving, merciful God doing such a thing. Setting aside that do as God says or else kind of interpretation, countless other scholars, religious scholars and interpreters have looked at this portion of this parable and they've basically said, we have no clue what Jesus is saying. kicking out and punishing someone who had just been invited by him to the table? We just don't know. So when you hear this parable, do you see yourselves as a king or in the place of the king? Or do you see yourselves as the people who stand up to the ego of the king, but do so in a way that is filled with violence and anger and murder? Where are you? Where are we in this parable? Where is God in this parable? Maybe we need to discover, maybe in order to discover what God is up to among us, we need this parable to afflict us rather than finding the comfort in it. So I wanted to look at it just a little bit differently. Matthew begins this portion, this passage, by telling us here at the start of chapter 22, what we just heard. Once more, Jesus spoke to them in parables. Who is the them that Jesus is speaking to here? Who is he talking to? If we back up one chapter, that's the start of chapter 21, if you remember, Jesus triumphantly enters Jerusalem on a donkey, here at the start of that chapter, to the cheers of the crowd and the rumblings of the religious leaders. He enters the city, he goes into the temple, and he starts turning over tables there just to make the leaders a little bit more angry. And when those religious leaders who have witnessed all of these things confront Jesus about why and by what authority he's doing these things, it is then, in response to that, that Jesus begins to tell them these parables, telling the religious leaders the parables we've been hearing these past couple weeks. 2 weeks ago, the parable of the two sons who are asked to go work in the vineyard. Last week, the parable of the wicked tenants, where, if you remember, at the conclusion of that parable that we heard last week, Matthew says, when the chief priests and the Pharisees heard Jesus' parables, they realized he was speaking about them. So I wonder, could Jesus, in telling this parable, could he have been saying that this is what the kingdom of heaven might look like if you believe that God acts like that king, if God is an angry and vengeful God? God lovingly hosts a banquet and invites people near and far, but when they don't respond in the way that he likes, kill them all. That's what we would get if we see God as someone easily offended, easily displeased, easily dishonored. That's what we get if we see God setting aside the graciousness and hospitality, all in an effort to save face and not be ignored. That's the kind of response we get if we see God as having an ego so big that any little offense brings us incredible wrath. Is that who our God is? Because believing that way has consequences. It turns us into angry and vengeful people. It makes us believe that if we are disrespected and our ego is crushed, that we need to respond in that same way with violence and wrath. But, could you see us responding like that? Have you looked around us lately? Pretty much all the violence and division around us seems to be based on ego and power. And if you get in the way of such things, such beliefs, well, to prepare to face the wrath or even die. These beliefs are how people turn into terrorists. It's how they turn into religious extremists. And it's nothing new to our times. Religions have been doing such things for centuries. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. The story that follows this parable that we'll hear next week is when the religious leaders confront Jesus with a trick question about paying taxes, asking to which king they should be loyal. Maybe Jesus knows our struggle with determining who to follow. So maybe instead of this king, if we play with this parable a bit more, the God figure in the story, Maybe that's the person who got kicked out of the celebration. The one who refuses to accept the terms of the ego-filled king. The one who offers a silent resistance to following human customs and ways. The one who would be rather bound hand and foot and thrown into the outer darkness of the cross and the grave and death. We don't know if that's what Jesus was pointing to in his parable, but couldn't that be a possibility? Isaiah points to a God who will host for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wines. Isaiah says that this God will destroy the shroud that is cast over all peoples. And in the psalm we heard today, the psalmist speaks of a God who prepares a table before us in the presence of our enemies. Not a war zone, a table. A table of welcome, a table of graciousness, a table of food and drink so that all may come and be fed with a feast of peace and righteousness. Things that truly point us to who our God is. Amen.